We wondered why individuals, corporations, and governments are not changing their behavior when the scientific consensus says we have so little time left. What is it about the way we are communicating these issues that makes it so difficult to implement the solutions available?
Welcome. You are listening to the Carbon series by Rethinking Climate. This is a series where we investigate the carbon debate, looking at the carbon footprint calculators and carbon offsets through interviews of some organizations from this field of work.
In this first episode, we introduce how carbon calculators work, and we try 3 different calculators ourselves, which are Ecosphere Plus, Aurora Sustainability, and Myclimate.
So the carbon removal and the carbon factor have been quite a challenging and short topic since the Kyoto Protocol. The carbon credits have been quite a bit of a discussion online and among governments especially. So there is a consistent mission to reduce carbon consumption or offsetting it. But this has also been judged a way for governments and companies to feel better about their own CO2 production.
Carbon itself does not contribute to emissions, but forms part of the molecules of carbon dioxide and methane, which trap heat in the atmosphere and are known as greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emissions are central to the issue of climate change, although achieving true sustainability requires far more system change than just reducing emissions. A tool which seems to be key to reducing our emissions is a carbon footprint calculator. But even with so many options of footprint calculators available, they don't necessarily seem to be as effective in causing behavior change as we wish they would be.
Nitrous oxide and ozone also create this greenhouse effect and therefore are included in the carbon part of the carbon footprint. However, these gases do not all have the same impact on the warming of the atmosphere. And so generally the emissions are reported as equivalent units of carbon dioxide, CO2 equivalents, to make numbers directly comparable.
What is a carbon footprint? A carbon footprint is meant to help people quantify the impact that they have in the environment in the hopes of taking responsibility for these emissions. So in the next clip, you'll see Daniel from Ecosphere, and they explain their reasoning behind and their methodology when they created the calculator.
Sure. Yeah, so our carbon calculator, we'll actually just start off by saying that Ecosphere, we're not a specific carbon footprinting company, and that's not our sort of main function. We do have a great partner in carbon analytics, and so they are that specifically. They're footprinting specialists. And basically, they helped us create this carbon calculator, which takes into account assumptions and calculations and data engine to provide estimates of carbon footprints and carbon based on sort of certain impact criteria. So the basic sort of methodology and factors basically are based on a combination of sort of the United Kingdom Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategies, so the UK BEIS, annually updated gas report conversion factors. And so the UK BEIS produces annual emissions conversions values for mandatory UK reporting for businesses, sorry. And so these values are what we use, and they're pretty widely used with some exceptions across the globe. So that's kind of why we use them, is that they're pretty sort of well and pretty up to date. We also use the World Resource Institute's greenhouse gas reporting protocol on top of that. And this is a widely used methodology for assessing, managing, reporting carbon emissions. So that's kind of the main methodology. I would also say that sort of our methodology is all public on our site. So you can go through, and we have different tabs. So we have the quick tab or the commuting tab, travel tab, events tab. Each one of these has its own assumptions that goes into the input criteria. All of those can be if you go onto our calculator, there's a little tab that says methodology, and that's all completely transparent, and you can see exactly how we do it. I think from your point is that, the carbon calculator, what is it? It's basically a way of people seeing what their footprint is, and people are more aware now than ever of carbon footprints and their responsibility on what they can do to address the climate climate crisis, which we're in, climate and biodiversity crisis. And actually, by having a carbon footprint calculation, this goes for individuals as well as companies, is that you can't even begin to sort of begin to reduce or fix or whatever what you have if you can't measure it. So you need to measure it first, and once you measure it, you can say, okay, this is my footprint. And then you need to create policies, you need to create sustainability programs, sustainability targets to bring that footprint down as much as you possibly can in-house. And then there's like everybody, we all have residual emissions and we all have residual carbon footprint, because we live in a world currently where we can be net zero by just, or we can't be completely carbon neutral by just, living in the technologies we have. That residual is what we can offset using high quality carbon offsets. But I think that the main sort of point is that, as part of ICROA, we really advocate people measure.
The idea of a footprint is that activities in our industrial processes and everyday actions emit these greenhouse gases, which have a long-lasting effect on the temperature of our atmosphere. A carbon footprint is the collective carbon emissions from everybody's daily activities, from what we buy, how we travel, what we eat, where we get our energy, and the waste we produce.
Activities that contribute to CO2 emissions can be either direct or indirect. Direct emissions come from activities you choose to do, such as driving and flying, whereas indirect emissions can be the greenhouse gases from processes earlier in the production chain, such as the emissions caused by the manufacturing of the car you drive, or from the mining processes to extract the virgin materials. A question arises about which emissions you're responsible for, and therefore which ones you're responsible for reducing.
So responsibility is something that we talk about a lot when it comes to carbon and who emits the most. And that is something, Amy, you approached with Danielle from Aurora Sustainability. And she explains, in fact, that, for instance, companies pollute more than individuals, but then there's sort of who's guilty and who feels guilty and who's not. And sort of the reasoning also behind the calculator.
And the reason that we've chosen to focus on the sustainability of individuals is because a lot of people say, oh, but it's corporates who have the highest emissions, and why are you guilting people and their carbon footprint? But at the end of the day, it's people who have purchasing power, it's people who drive organizations, and it's people who also impact regulation. So we started with a really basic carbon footprint calculator, just as a way to help people to understand their impact on the planet. We did some really early research, and what we realized is that people do genuinely want to make a difference, but they don't always know the most impactful way to do that. And so we created the calculator as a way for people to understand their impact and to make it really easy to make changes. Something that we've always stood by is that we want Aurora to be accessible. It's not about shaming anyone or judging anyone, but also scientific. So everything that we do is based on, for instance, carbon emission factors and other standards that make sure that our calculations are as accurate as possible, but also easy to use and understand.
More and more individuals are now trying to become more sustainable. And therefore, we must understand which actions, as you pointed out, Amy, are actually contributing to an increase of CO2 emissions and so on. So we looked actually at quite a few carbon calculators that we previously mentioned. We, again, interviewed them. And so the results that came out were quite interesting. For instance, myself and Christian were not able to look at the Aurora Sustainability calculators because that's reserved for South Africa, right, Amy? Right, but you were able to actually complete it. So what were your results?
Yeah, so I think the big difference about when you put in where you're from is around where you get your energy and how green your grid is. So South Africa has one of the dirtiest grids, which Aurora says when you choose it. And so obviously for energy, I had a pretty low score. And for transport as well, because we don't have a huge amount of public transport that is reliable. So I end up driving far more than I would want to. Things like food was much better. And I agree with Christian that it is presented to you in a very user-friendly way. It encourages you to then reduce your impact afterwards. And I guess this links into the idea of what is the purpose of the different calculators. So as Danny from Aurora made it pretty clear, their purpose is to help people understand where their biggest areas of CO2 emissions are, and then help people learn how to reduce it. So if your food is a very low score, they will encourage you to reduce your meat consumption, maybe change over to renewable energies. I think with Ecosphere Plus, their business model is around creating a carbon market, and that includes carbon offsetting. So they give you a solid number at the end of it with the idea that you're going to offset that amount of carbon that you're producing. So I think that's why you need a far more scientific number when you're doing that sort of quiz. Whereas with Aurora, it's more to give you a sense of where you need to reduce your consumption. And I think those are two very important parts of your carbon emissions, is taking responsibility for where you can reduce them, and then where you can't reduce them, you can use the option of offsetting.
Which is something that Myclimate does. So when the calculators there is extremely user-friendly. Actually, very few answers are available when you actually go question by question, and the result is, it appears vague. So possibly has its importance because it sort of then goes basically point by point, very briefly, of where you are polluting the most. So yes, you do have a range, but it wouldn't be as specific as Ecosphere Plus, although it does have then Myclimate some offset projects. So that's very curious to see how every company sort of approaches that connection between calculator and offset project. So
Ecosphere Plus, I don't find it really immediate. It just says about the carbon offset,
yeah,
but it doesn't give you I don't know what to say, a view of your carbon footprint on itself.
So I think Ecosphere does it in very like numerical results. So they give you the CO2 equivalents in kgs of CO2, which isn't very user-friendly. And I also found it quite difficult to figure out all of the numbers which I had to input. So all of that required quite a lot more work from my side. And I feel like if you were an ordinary person, you would be less likely to go through with it. But it is also, I think you're aware of the fact that it's more scientific and that all of their numbers are there, and there's a whole lot of transparency around how they've calculated it.
It just requires a lot of participation from the user using it, but the numbers could also not be entirely correct because I could be approximating just my own numbers. So I'm not sure how that could be reliable. I could be actually polluting more than what the calculator actually tells me, but that's not their fault. That's sort of the user's ability to actually input the numbers correctly.
Well, I think that's they assuming that their target audience kind of have a vested interest and therefore are going to do that background work more.
I guess so. Yeah, but do you feel like, so Christian, did you feel like their website, also the way it presents, was useful in sort of finding the calculator? And when you did it, it would, who's do you think in first impression is the targeted audience as well?
Well, personally, I find it really difficult to find the calculator on Ecosphere Plus site. So I actually went to the Emmy's video to find where it was. And I also find the website not so immediate, whereas the Aurora one is really good, also good looking, and also how they show your result is really is really immediate. Like you know where you can work better. Like in my case, the worst score is 0 out of 30 in investment, and like the best one is transport or food, for example. And I know that in those categories, I'm doing a good job in terms of carbon emissions. And yeah, I think Aurora is one of the most user-friendly one.
One thing which Kai's quote leads into is that obviously neither of them are taking into consideration like every possible area of your life which you have emissions, but that having it be more user-friendly and a quicker quiz will have as much of an impact rather than getting every possible kilogram of CO2 that you're emitting. So it's like you have to weigh up the fact that people aren't going to do a quiz that takes every little bit of your life into consideration, but that getting like an estimate is good enough.
Yes, but that's also another question we sort of asked with the series. Is it good enough? Like, what's the point of actually having a calculator? Does it really? Yeah, I understand that. So I'll give a personal example. I do understand that if I were to reduce my my meat consumption, if I were not to, so I'm comfortably in taking public transportation because I can, but like in your case, Amy, you were saying you can't, but you kind of have to take the car. Otherwise, how would you study, work, or live your life in the sense that succeed in what you're doing? And that's interesting. However, there are several points to make because every life is different. So I am alone, so I can take public transportation. What if you're family or, you know, considerations of that sort? So yes, my family could be not eating that much meat and I could still take public transportation. How does that affect my well-being as well? If I had 3 kids, the car is way better in that sense, possibly. So it's user-friendly, but then the purpose of the whole thing is sort of a little bit out there. Like but I also understand that it's a little bit hard to actually explain it, because even though these organizations tell you like, hey, you're polluting the most in this area, you can improve it. Here it offsets. But I think that the whole purpose of this could be taking it to the next level. How best can we actually match the two so that we can, you know, improve the offset projects, and what are the limitations there? And that's something we will touch upon in the future episodes. But that I think it's quite a union of the conversations. And yes, so
also they do not consider the difference between like a person who lives alone, or like people like me that I live with my parents. So all the decision about the energy consumption and the heat system of the house are on their decision. So I just put the information that I have from my parents' decision, not from my decision. So this is really something that we have to take into account.
Yeah, and especially if you're a young worker or a student, most probably you would travel in apartments that are not owned by you. And so there you already cannot pick, even if it's not your parents, you cannot pick how you use the energy, how you want to switch to a provider, or even choices of transportation. Like I studied far away from where I lived far away where I studied when I lived in London, and you sort of can't really, again, there pick that much. I could go by bike, but it would be really far. I would prefer to take something else. Sort of limitation in that sense, that's true. And I think it also goes back to reasonings we had in previous episodes and other interviews, where how much can I actually do? And what does this tell me when I do these calculators? So, and again, we've mentioned climate anxiety or guilt. So that's something.
The limitations are quite obvious, because if you want to have a perfectly fitting, a very precise result on your CO2 footprint, you would need to take so many data into account. You would need to answer so many questions, which is nearly impossible. So the main challenge of these calculators is to provide a user-friendly tool which leads you to a very good result. So let's say which covers around 95% of the real CO2 footprint instead of let's say focusing on 99%. And this is the real challenge, but I think we managed it over the course of the last years.
So I've noticed that the calculator is actually quite simple. So you have achieved the user-friendly approach. How best do you communicate these limitations to the public? So I assume that I could be using this calculator and it's actually giving me a good idea of how much footprint I'm causing. So what is my footprint? But how are you communicating, again, this limitation to the person using the calculator?
Yeah, we try to understand the motivation and also the aim of the person or the company using this. So if they want to get a first indication or if they want to offset their emissions, then I think there is not a real need to talk further or to talk about these limitations. But if, let's say, for instance, a company wants to get the result and wants to move on the path of reducing the CO2 footprint, then you have, of course, to talk about the limitations, and then you have to offer, let's say, different ways of calculating these CO2 emissions. So that's when we tap in. I think for individuals, it's perfectly fitting. If someone is approaching us and telling, hey, I want to also cover, let's say, the pets in my home and my children and my food behaviors, then of course, then we maybe give the advice to let's say to use another calculator. But it's really depending on what you want to do with these results.
I was just going to say, I think it links a lot to an episode like the one I did with Helen Moffat. And I think we're going to touch on this more later in the series. But when we discuss making choices around reducing your carbon emissions, we're generally talking about people who have the privilege to choose and to make those choices. So obviously, the majority of people in the world do not actually have the privilege to say, I'm going to change over to a green energy supplier when their government isn't providing that, or I'm going to choose to only eat food that is grown on organic regenerative farms. That is such a privileged choice to be able to make. And so, yeah, it's sort of a disclaimer that when we are discussing these issues of where you should be reducing your impact, it is within the reason and the context of having that privilege to make the choice.
Yes, and that should, however, come through when these calculators and offset projects exist. So the carbon removal conversation, as I said before, it's a lot based on the government and the companies, but as a citizen, it's quite hard to go back and tell a company, hey, you should improve, because I can only do so much. Like, whether I'm privileged or not, I still can only do so much. And well, if you're very privileged, then there's a lot you can do if you're actually contributing to polluting quite a bit. And there are choices that you can make. But then again, alone, I couldn't be doing that much if then 3 buildings next to me are, still using carbon or gas, or polluting in that sense. So it is quite a good point to make. And
I think it's really about showing the impact that an individual can have. There's that positive, that quote that says, I'm only one person, I can't make a change, said 23 billion people. So I think really just showing the impact that an individual can have at a large scale, and that if we all start to make small changes, that will make a big change. And the power of purchasing power and the power of impact on regulation and the power of the masses is something that I feel quite strongly about, and that I think we can probably do better to communicate in terms of the impact that one person can make.
We've discussed it, but one of the facts which almost sparked my interest in this topic of calculating a carbon footprint and carbon offsets was when I read that the whole idea of a carbon footprint was first coined by scientists working at BP. And the whole reason they came up with this idea was to shift the blame of carbon emissions off of the large corporations and organizations onto individuals. And I think that's a really important thing to remember in this process as well is that we as individuals do have a collective power, but we also don't have the full responsibility.
When I sent you the form to fill out, you said that you describe yourself as a climate hypocrite. Why is that?
Definitely, yeah. Because I really love to fly. I love the feeling when a plane picks up speed and magically you're almost weightless when it goes up, and then you can look at the earth from above.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It's magical. It's beautiful. So occasionally, I in the past I did fly, definitely, and I take showers, and my home does have a natural gas heater. So each and every morning I turn on the shower, and I'm a hypocrite, and I'm wrong. And the thing is, I think I'm not the only one.
No,
I think because
not,
I know many other people, and I think to come back to that, it is not. This is the biggest problem of this individual approach to climate solutions, because there is no way not to feel guilty, because we are part of this this system that's in decline. We are part of it. So to say you're not a part of it, it's just not true. And to force people to step out of their, especially social system, for Native Americans, this was like the biggest punishment there could be, to force someone out of the community. So basically what we're doing now is saying, to be good, to be a good person, you need to put yourself out of society. It's the biggest punishment psychologically there is. So I think to ask it for people is just ridiculous. So I'm a proud climate hypocrite, and I'm actually pretty happy to be surrounded by many other climate hypocrites, and who are and we're together marching and working on a world we actually want.
Just gonna say that these calculators put too much pressure and too much responsibility on the hand of individuals, where we all know that the most of emissions are caused by big companies and also the decision of our governments. So it is true that every one of us can make the difference, but it's also true that we don't have all the responsibility for the changes.
So one question I was going to ask you before, how did the calculators make you feel? Because I think that's sort of essential, because when I actually filled out the calculators and so on, I sort of went, well, because I was lucky to study this before, I sort of knew where it was going to hit a little bit. So again, it hit me, but I went, is there really much that I can do? Again, I'm sort of stopped by the fact that I live with my family, and I'm sort of stopped by the fact that I cannot pick my diet. Luckily, with the pandemic, we're also being home. But then again, last year I traveled for work, and there was not much of an option I could have picked. I had to travel for work. So yeah, how did the calculators make you feel?
I think for me, I'm not sure if any of the results were a surprise, because kind of as you touched on, when you are surrounding yourself or putting yourself in the world of sustainability and following lots of news around climate change, I would hope that most people would be aware of what actions affect their carbon footprint and more generally their sustainability impact. So I kind of knew which areas were going to be my best and my worst. And I think it's good to put a number to it. But I think if I were to use one, I would be more likely to use the Ecosphere one, which would then lead me to offsetting it. So I think I'm more likely to make the choice of, say, something like my transport. I can't really reduce that impact, so maybe I should be offsetting it. And then I think having a number which I can assign to how much I'm polluting is more useful. But I think as an entry level, becoming interested in sustainability and working out your footprint, something like Aurora or Myclimate is far friendlier.
Yes, I think that as we are a little experienced in this topic, maybe we don't find the results so exciting or new, and or I mean, we expected these results to be this, but for new users, as Emmy was saying, it would be really impactful, I think, for them to see really how much bad or good they are doing, comparing to these small actions such as taking the car or avoiding eating meat and something like that. So I think that for most people, it would be a nice tool to raise awareness and consciousness.
Really like what you're saying, Amy and Christian. It's going to be useful in the future because with offset, there's a whole big discussion there too. So you may have answered, you can offset it, but what are the limitations there? So I think, again, we're going to touch upon that more deeply in the future episodes. So thank you very much for those who listened. You listened to the Carbon Series, a product by Rethinking Climate. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are also on social media, and to the next episode.